It's like you can't go anywhere these days without seeing someone glued to their phone.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty much.
I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And it really does make you wonder about how they're affecting us in ways we haven't even thought of.
Oh, definitely.
Well, you sent me some really interesting research on that very topic this week, so I thought we could deep dive into it. It's about whether the radio waves from our phones...
RF-EMR, right.
Exactly. Radio frequency, electromagnetic radiation.
Yeah.
Could that be affecting, well, sperm quality?
Yeah, that's a big one, for sure. The research you sent over actually includes a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So they've basically looked at a bunch of different studies and kind of combined all the results, to see if there are any bigger trends.
Right.
10 studies, to be precise, all looking at the potential link between mobile phone exposure and, well, sperm health.
Okay.
And in terms of how we measure sperm health, there are 3 main things we're going to focus on. There's motility, so how well they swim, viability, so whether they're alive or not, and then just the concentration, so how many sperm are present.
Okay, and this is a huge area to look into because we know that something like 1 in 7 couples in, higher income countries have trouble conceiving.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And there's also been some evidence that semen quality has been declining in some countries, and it's not totally clear why.
Yeah, there's a lot we still don't know.
Yeah. So scientists are looking into everything, but mobile phones, I mean, considering how many people use them, pretty much all the time,
Right.
it's kind of a big deal to understand how that might be playing a role.
For sure.
So what did they find? I mean, what was the big takeaway from all 10 of these studies together?
Okay, so the main thing that came out of it, and this was from both in vitro studies, so lab experiments,
Okay.
and in vivo studies, which are those studies that look at people in their everyday lives. So they looked at both types of studies. And when they put all that data together, it seems like there is a link between mobile phone exposure and sperm quality, and not a good one. It looks like there is some sort of negative effect there.
Okay, so negative in what sense? What exactly were they seeing changing?
So the biggest changes were in sperm motility and viability.
Okay.
On average, when they compared the groups that were exposed to mobile phones to those that weren't, motility was about 8.1% lower.
Wow.
And for viability, the drop was a bit bigger, about 9.1% lower.
Okay.
Now, it is important to remember, of course, that these numbers come with what we call a confidence interval.
Oh, right.
So it's not an exact thing. Like for motility, that range was between a decrease of 13.1% and just 3.2%.
Okay.
And for viability, it was between 18.4% and just 0.2%.
Got it.
So there's a bit of a range there, just so you know. It gives you an idea of how certain the researchers are about those numbers.
So like a margin of error, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're looking at maybe around an 8 to 9% drop on average in those 2 areas.
Right.
But you mentioned concentration earlier.
Right.
What about, the actual number of sperm? Did they find any effect on that?
That's where it gets a bit less clear. The effect on sperm concentration was a little more equivocal, so the evidence wasn't quite as strong either way from the studies that they looked at.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we're seeing these potential effects on like how well they swim and whether they're even alive, but the jury's still out on the numbers.
Right.
Which kind of leads to the question of, how is this happening? Like, what are the researchers saying about what's going on in the body that might be causing this?
Well, they talk about 2 main possibilities. Thermal effects, so things related to heat.
Okay.
And then non-thermal effects, which are like other ways that those radio waves could be interacting with the cells.
Okay, so let's start with the non-thermal stuff. What are they thinking is going on there?
Well, the main idea is that this RF-EMR could be increasing the production of what are called reactive oxygen species. We call them ROS.
Okay.
And now it's important to know that at low levels, these ROS are actually necessary.
Oh, okay.
They actually play a role in, normal sperm function.
Right.
But if there's too much, then they become damaging and could lead to DNA damage in the sperm.
So it's like too much of anything.
Right. Exactly.
Even something that's normally good for you could be harmful.
Exactly. And the researchers actually point out that when you have too much of this ROS, it can disrupt something called the mitochondrial electron transport chain in the sperm.
Okay.
Now think of mitochondria like the little powerhouses of the cells.
Right.
And that chain is how they generate energy for the sperm to be able to swim.
Makes sense.
So if that gets messed up, it's going to affect their motility. They actually even mentioned a specific in vitro study. It was from 2009 by DeJulius and his team, and they found that when sperm were exposed to mobile phone frequencies, they saw more of these ROS being produced in the mitochondria,
Okay.
and they saw more DNA damage.
A
And
lot.
along with that, decreased motility and viability.
So pretty direct link there, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely a connection.
So what about the thermal effects then? Is it just like the phone's getting warm in our pockets, close to
Yeah.
the testicles?
That's definitely a part of it. The idea that, keeping your phone near your reproductive organs could be raising the temperature there. And we know that's not good for sperm production.
Right.
But the researchers also brought up a good point, which is that the heat we feel might actually be coming more from the phone itself,
Oh, interesting.
that the components working, rather than directly from the radio waves. The frequencies that mobile phones use are thought to have pretty minimal heating effects on their own.
Okay, so like how a laptop gets hot on your lap,
Exactly.
even if you're not really doing anything on it.
Right. And what's interesting is if it were just a heating issue, you might expect to see a bigger impact on sperm concentration
Oh, okay.
because that's more related to the production process. But what they're seeing here is a clearer effect on motility and viability, which are more about the health of the sperm that are already there, including their DNA.
Right.
So it's kind of leaning more towards these non-thermal mechanisms, like that increased ROS production maybe playing a bigger role.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got these potential effects and some ideas about how they might be happening, but can you tell me a bit more about these studies themselves?
Sure.
Like what kinds of studies were included in this analysis, and were there any, important details about how they were done that we should know?
Yeah, definitely. So they looked at a combination of both in vitro studies, those lab-based ones, and in vivo, those observational ones.
Right.
So in the in vitro studies, it's very controlled. They're exposing sperm samples directly to RF-EMR in a very specific setting.
Right.
Whereas the in vivo studies are looking at groups of men and how much they use their mobile phones in everyday life.
Got it.
And then they analyze their sperm quality. And in all of the studies, the mobile phone frequencies that were being used were between 800 to 2200 megahertz,
Okay.
which is pretty typical for mobile communication.
Yeah.
And they also mentioned something called SAR, which is the specific absorption rate.
Oh, right.
So this basically measures how much of that radio frequency energy your body absorbs when you use your phone.
Right.
And there are limits to how high that can be. Like the maximum is 2.0 watts per kilogram.
Okay.
But most phones actually operate lower, more around 1.4 W kilogram.
Got it.
So just to let you know. Now, when they look specifically at the sperm motility studies,
Okay.
they actually found something interesting about the exposure time. So the studies where the exposure was shorter, 60 minutes or less, actually showed more consistent results than those where the exposure was longer. And it's worth noting that almost all of those short exposure studies were the in vitro ones, in the lab.
Oh, interesting.
None of the in vivo studies out in the real world had exposure times that short. So it could mean that the length of the exposure actually plays a role.
So maybe those shorter bursts of radiation in the lab are showing more clear impact on how the sperm swim.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, at least for motility. And another thing that was really important is that in all 10 studies, they used the World Health Organization, WHO, guidelines for how to analyze the semen samples.
Oh, okay.
Which is really good because it means there was a standardized way of measuring sperm quality across all of the different research groups, so you can compare their results more easily.
Yeah, that definitely gives the findings more weight if everyone's using the same methods. But were there any limitations or, things we should keep in mind when we're interpreting all of this?
Yeah, for sure. Like any research, it's important to consider the limitations. And one of the main things they mention was what's called high heterogeneity between the studies.
Heterogeneity.
Yeah, basically it means the results of the individual studies varied more than you might expect just by chance.
Okay.
And when that happens, it's harder to make really solid conclusions.
Makes sense.
And they actually noted that for both motility and viability, it seemed like those results were really influenced by that 2009 in vitro study we talked about earlier, the DEULIS one.
Okay.
And for viability and concentration, it seems like a 2011 study by Feo and his team also had a big impact on those overall results. So it's possible that a couple of specific studies are driving a lot of the findings.
So a few individual studies might be kind of carrying a lot of the weight here.
Right.
Yeah.
And with the in vivo studies, it's tricky because, you're observing people in their daily lives.
Right.
And it's hard to account for all the other things that could be affecting their sperm quality. Like age, whether they smoke, their overall health. Those all play a role, but it's not always possible to, perfectly account for every single one in these kinds of studies. But The researchers did say that the fact that they saw this trend towards negative effects in both the lab studies and the real-world studies
Right.
does make the case stronger that there's a real link between mobile phone use and lower sperm quality.
Okay. Interesting.
They also pointed out that in most of the studies, the average sperm parameters of the men were still above the WHO's lower reference values for fertile men.
Okay.
So it's not like the studies were just looking at men who already had fertility issues.
Got it. So we've got this like growing body of evidence that there could be this connection.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean? Like, why should someone listening to this be concerned?
Well, even an 8% reduction in sperm motility, which is what they're seeing,
Right.
that can have a real impact, for men who are already subfertile or whose sperm are like just on the edge of that borderline.
Right.
That kind of a drop could be enough to make it a lot harder to conceive.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be an issue.
Yeah. And the researchers also suggested that maybe all the mobile phone radiation we're exposed to is just one part of a bigger picture.
Okay.
Like there are lots of environmental factors in our lives that could all be contributing to lower sperm quality in general.
Right.
Maybe that's why we're seeing this decline in fertility rates.
Interesting.
They even mentioned that Wi-Fi signals from laptops have also been shown to negatively affect sperm in some research.
Oh, wow.
So it might not just be the phone itself.
So it's like a cumulative effect of all these different exposures.
Right, potentially. And this really just highlights how much more research we need, to get a better understanding of the effects on sperm viability and other things like the shape of the sperm, what's called morphology, and, the integrity of their DNA. They really need to look more closely at how long the exposure is, how intense it is, and we need better ways to measure how much each person is actually exposed to on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Ideally, we need more long-term studies, following men over time. And randomized controlled trials would be great to really figure out how big of a deal this is for the general population. And they also want to dig deeper into those different ways that RF-EMR might be affecting sperm.
Right.
Both the heating and the non-heating aspects. Maybe comparing what happens when the exposure is constant versus intermittent.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a lot more research is needed to really understand this fully. But for now, what's the message we should be taking away from all of this?
I think the main takeaway from all this research you shared is that there does seem to be a link between how much we use our mobile phones and the health of our sperm, specifically how well they swim and their overall viability.
Right.
Now, we definitely need more research to figure out what it all means, clinically.
Yeah.
But this is definitely a good starting point. It's important to be aware of it.
Yeah, it's something we should all be thinking about. So here's something for you to think about, listener. We all use mobile technology so much these days, and it makes life so much easier, and convenient. But there could be these biological impacts that we don't fully understand yet.
All right.
So how do we balance all of that?
Yeah.
It's really about our relationship with technology and the choices that we make.
It is, yeah.
Something to think about.
Definitely.
Well, this was a fascinating deep dive.
It was.
Thanks for taking us through it.
You're welcome.
And to you, the listener, thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.